So well, we can divide it into two problems. We talk about money. We divide it into two problems. And the first is campaign finance, which I'm not actually going to spend that much time on, but if you are interested in the topic, Lawrence Lessig is the guy. So he's an academic. He's been writing about money and politics for a long time, and so we'll just watch a couple of minutes of this.
Lessig is an outspoken critic of the way political campaigns are funded in this country. This was him back in 2011, lambasting the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that lifted restrictions on corporate spending in politics.
The funders say dance, and they produce this marionette Congress, a system which Professor James Sample describes filled with junkies.
Well, that was then, and this was Lawrence Lessig just last week announcing his latest online venture.
We want to build a super PAC big enough to end all super PACs. Our goal for this election cycle is to raise enough money to change the results in 5 House districts across the country.
Confused? So here you have a campaign finance crusader soliciting money for the purpose of influencing elections. The irony, of course, is not lost on Lessig, who's here tonight to explain what is this PAC all about.
Well, the hope of this PAC, the super PAC to end all super PACs, citizen-funded, crowdsourced in the funding, is to find a way to elect a Congress that wants to pass fundamental reform, to change the way we raise money in elections. Right now, it's the tiniest fraction of the 1%, maybe 0.05% of Americans, who are the relevant funders of campaigns. And that produces a Congress that bends to keep them happy and increasingly is not so interested in keeping America happy.
Right, first I want to talk about how you raise the money and then what you're going to do with it. So you launched this campaign May 1st. Already you've raised $500,000. It's pretty amazing. You're 51% of your goal, so you got another 500, you've got 24 days left. You're doing pretty well.
Yeah.
So once you get the 1 million, then what happens?
So when we get the 1 million, we're going to get that matched.
Who's going to match it?
Well, we're not going to announce the match until it's complete, but it will be a split match that will make it clear that this is not a partisan project. Then we're going to run a $5 million Kickstarter. So with these Kickstarter-like campaigns, we only have to pay if we meet our goal. So if we don't meet our goal, then your cards are charged, but if we do meet our goal, then we can go forward. And we'll get that $5 million match. And we'll have the money we need to run the really prototype campaign that we want to run this cycle, to demonstrate this issue is important to Americans, to figure out how to win in the elections we need to win, and to set us up for a much, much bigger campaign in 2016.
How are you going to identify people who agree with you, who think that sincerely campaign finance reform must change? What's to say that they wouldn't agree with you to get your money, and then literally when it comes down to it, they're not going to make that vote in Congress?
Yeah, that's a hard problem. I mean, the fact is that many people have lost faith that you can trust anything that they say. But we're picking candidates that we believe will set up the issue clearly. So it's black and white. One side is fundamentally in favor of reform, the other side isn't. And it'll be very hard for that person to back away once they've committed to that reform. They've got to promise to co-sponsor the fundamental reform. And we'll set this up so that people see this is a campaign about that. And when we win in these 5 races, we'll have a very strong message going into 2016 to say to the rest of Congress, look, we're going to be back, and you better be on the right side of the issue when we come back.
So a great example of a policy entrepreneur. So who knows anything about Citizens United? Court case? Lucas?
What about it? I mean, it was a court case whose justification was that corporations are people and therefore have the right to free speech, which in the United States means the ability to pay for something.
Right, so long story short, where we are with Citizens United and a few other court cases is that there really isn't a way to limit campaign contributions, right? If you've got the money, then you, because of free speech, then you're allowed to put that money wherever you want. So this really complicates efforts like Loris Lessig's to get money out of campaigns. And the argument that he makes is it's hard to connect campaign finance directly to corruption in politics, sort of in a big, sort of writ large way. But the idea of it, he argues, and we'll get to this, is corrupting. So that's sort of part one, is the money in campaign finance. But the other part, and you read more about that for today, is the gift economy. Okay, and that's very different. So let's talk about lobbying. So the basic definition of lobbying is a lobbyist seeks to influence government officials on behalf of paying clients. Now, more recently, a lobbyist can be registered who works for a nonprofit or an advocacy organization, and increasingly, as we'll talk about today, lobbyists don't register. Sort of there's a backlash against registering, which has complicated things a bit. But generally speaking, lobbyists, a lot of them are former members of Congress, they're former congressional staff, they get paid pretty well. That's a pretty low number, sort of the big, someone who was, say, an approach subcommittee chair or something can earn, into the millions once they go over to K Street. So this was actually pretty rare, even a few decades ago. But starting in the 1980s, there was a real sea change. You have higher salaries for lobbyists. There's sort of the idea that being a lobbyist was dirty changed, and also the idea that hiring a former member of Congress wasn't a good idea because they're lazy. That changed. And so you start seeing more and more members of Congress becoming lobbyists starting in the 1980s. Not new. You'll notice that the 1850s, our very first lobbyist was the gun lobby, so they've been around a while. 1875, and this is sort of the classic, when you think about corruption in Congress, we think about bribery, right? Just straight dollars for votes kind of behavior. And what we'll talk about today is there's a lot more to it. There's that, but there's a lot more to it than that. So, numbers of lobbyists. Any thoughts on this? Any comments? I can tell you that in this is a midpoint of 2013. By the end of 2013, it was 12,300, and then in 2014, it's 11,000 some odd. And this is from 98. Any thoughts on the numbers? Yes, ma'am.
Well, two things. It sort of surges a little bit around presidential elections.
Mhm.
And then these must be registered ones, right? So
Correct.
it probably isn't capturing what's actually going on.
Right.
Although it may be part of it.
Right. So the real question is, especially when you start seeing a decline here, is it going to go up as you get closer to a presidential, or is there something different happening, as in people aren't registering? Or is there something else going on? Like, Congress isn't doing much these days, right? So maybe it's a different kind of lobbying that's happening, and which doesn't require registration. Maybe it's grassroots or grass tops. Does anybody know what that is?
What's the term for like big lobbying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm a lobbyist, and I don't know, what's the subject? I don't know, some healthcare. Let's call it healthcare. And I have a particular interest in healthcare, right? So let's say there are two options. There are lots of options. Say there are two. I can go to a member of Congress office and say, I'm representing this client, and this is what we think, and, we hope you'll pay attention to us. Or you can go to constituent level, right, and freak out some constituents and get them to call their member of Congress. That may be much, much, much more effective, right? So spending the money at the ground level. Grass tops is finding the leaders in these communities, right? So going to, Marietta, Georgia, and figuring out who the connected people are, who can mobilize people, who members of Congress will take a call from, those are important people. So maybe that's a better way to use lobbying dollars if, as we see here, lobbying in the sort of traditional heading to a member's office is becoming less effective. So we'll talk about why it's becoming less effective. Okay, so this is kind of hilarious.
If you want City Hall to take your call, if you want the state to legislate, if you advocate for the grassroots, be honest. Who else is going to get your words heard in Congress? If you run a pack, go back an amendment, or want to influence a bill passing through the Senate, or affect the quality of a policy on healthcare, crime, or the economy, we're the lobbyists. K Street's the hood. We're much maligned and misunderstood. So here's a rap to add fact to fiction. We're not greasing the palms of the politicians. Yeah, we might influence legislative achievements, but pay to play, no way. Don't believe it. The founding fathers foreseen this. Part of the genius was given the right to petition for redress of a grievance. So if you want City Hall,
It goes on. So a couple of things. I don't know. I think about a lot of the things when I hear that. Why do they feel a rap is a good idea? What are they doing and why? This is a sort of a lobbying association. What's going on here? This is what a lobbyist
They're
does.
defending themselves.
They're defending themselves. Why do they need to defend themselves?
They said there's a reputation that they're just like giving money to politicians, and that's really not what they're doing.
Right, and here's the problem, it's right here. This is sort of the root of the problem, so we're gonna talk about that. All right, so these are all the things that you can do, and you don't have to be registered to do them. There's a lot actually you can do, and again, that goes back to, maybe we don't need to register, maybe we can do lots of stuff without registering. So lobbying has been a problem, but sort of way, way, way under the radar for a long time. You have so increasingly in the early 90s, the problem was perceived as lobbying being under the radar and people not registering. But then as you get into say 1995, it becomes much more overt. So mid-1990s, so this was launched in 95, Grover Norquist, Tom DeLay, Rick Santorum, the K Street Project. Does anyone know about the K Street Project? So the idea was, K Street is where all the lobby firms are in Washington. And so the K Street Project was, so during Bush administration, the Republicans had the House, the Senate, the White House. So these guys said to the lobbying firms, when you have an opening, you need to hire a lobbyist, a Republican. Right, so if someone's coming off the Hill, either a member of Congress or a staffer is coming off the Hill, basically these guys said, you need to take them and you need to sort of populate your lobby firms with Republicans. Right, so that was sort of part one of this, is there was a real, sort of overt quid pro quo going on. Okay, so some examples, and a lot of it was fueled by earmarks. So what's an earmark?
Congressman takes an appropriation bill, and whatever money is appropriated to a certain department, they can then specifically say to that department, you have to put the money towards this project, which is usually in their district or state.
Right. So an appropriations bill is essentially, so the appropriations for health and human services, or the appropriations for whatever. If you look at the appropriations committees, they're broken down into subcommittees. Each of those subcommittees gets an appropriations bill. And essentially, what it's supposed to do is send money to that agency or agencies, right, in that sort of policy arena. What an earmark does is specifies, and it comes from notching a pig's ear, a farmer would notch a pig's ear, is it specifies money that will specifically go to a particular project or organization or entity. But they would cloak it. So for example, they might say, $2 million to rebuild a library in zip code 19038. Well, there's only one library in zip code 19038. So they wouldn't say, it's going to such and such university. So they'd find ways to cloak it. And similarly, corporations and so on would get that. So this dip is just a little aberration, but then after that it goes way down. But so you can see, starting in the 90s, huge increase in earmarks. Let's talk about the king of earmarks.
At age 90, Robert Byrd of West Virginia has been in the Senate longer than anybody else in history.
I'm the oldest thing around here other than the building.
And he's had extraordinary control over earmarks, grants of your tax dollars without normal public review. Byrd was the first senator to rack up a total of $1 billion in earmarks for his home state. That was in 1999. Today, he's past the $3 billion mark.
Are you listening?
In his famously colorful Senate speeches, Byrd has repeatedly defended his earmarks.
Some members have asserted that all, A-L-L, all, earmark funding is wasteful spending or an abuse of power. Hogwash.
The Constitution frowns on sitting members of Congress funding projects in their own name. Senator Byrd doesn't seem to have a problem with it. West Virginia is filled with ventures paid for by your tax dollars, but named after him. You can take the Robert Byrd Highway to the Robert Byrd Locks and Dam, explore space with the Robert Byrd Telescope, and work at the Robert Byrd Hilltop Office Complex. In all, we found more than 40 projects bearing the Byrd name. Many of them sound perfectly reasonable, but the problem is other needy communities never get a crack at the money.
He's unabashedly unapologetic about his earmarks.
Watchdog Leslie Page calls the earmarks bird droppings.
It's always been to the victor goes the spoils with these earmarks, which means if you've got a member who sits on a powerful committee, you're going to get the lion's share of that money.
But it's made Byrd a hero back home.
Yeah, man, you're looking at Big Daddy. Big Daddy.
That's Byrd at the opening of the Robert Byrd Biotech Center, to which he generously gave $35.6 million of your tax dollars.
Our efforts to construct this facility began where? With a visit to my office. Man. To my office. Yeah.
Byrd wouldn't agree to an interview with us. His 5 decades in Congress have been money in the bank for West Virginians, so much so they might consider some sort of monument in Byrd's name, except there are already so many. Cheryl Atkinson, CBS News, Washington.
What do you think about earmarks?
I call that a good senator.
Why?
I mean, you want someone to get the job of a senator, and if they're doing an effective job, is to get things back for their district or for their state. And he's done very well for West Virginia.
Does
And
anybody know anything about West Virginia? Have you been to West Virginia? Those roads are like butter. Right? There's a lot of money that's gone to West Virginia. Now, it's also a very poor place. Right? So one could argue, we need to help West Virginia. Okay, what's good and bad about earmarks?
Well, it's still a very poor place, right?
It's still very.
So they didn't work.
I mean, it would be even more poor without.
Well, the point is there's more than one way to use other people's money to fund things that aren't, freeways in high schools and possibly things that aren't necessarily needed unless you're just trying to win votes.
Okay,
It's a lot easier to win a vote when there's a physical building there than when there's a policy or
okay,
something that might be less explicitly local.
okay.
I mean, and we've already talked about it.
I think politicians tend to favor projects that are like highly invisible, like say the construction of a major building with their name named after them because that's visible. Whereas they might be less likely to try to earmark things for say education or school books.
Well, I totally agree with Akeem that he's a good senator, definitely, but also you can focus on other things, like for instance, the state is still poor, so these things might be driven out of getting popularity, like he thinks that he can do something when he focuses on this, but if he's going to increase the, for instance, in a way or another, the income of the state's residents, this can't be done, so let me just focus on this. That's a strategy, I guess.
It also dilutes the executive branch from doing their job in a lot of ways, because if now they have to put money into these things, then they can't put money into other freeways in other states,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
It also underscores the importance of having people in office who reflect the people on the ground, because he can only give earmarks to things he's aware of. And there's an argument to be made that, like, you know, he's only familiar with certain things, which means that not because he is intentionally ignoring things, he's just not aware of certain things. That could play out in a certain way, but under other people, maybe it could play out.
So it's not a very scientific way of, let's say, solving poverty in West Virginia, right? It's a little random. And the argument is if you give all the money to the correct agency and if they know what they're doing, at least there's a review process, right? So the money goes to a school in West Virginia and that school has to show they've spent the money well and there's reporting and there's some sort of evaluation. Whereas an earmark is, you know, a picture with big check. That's it. I was a lobbyist briefly in Florida for a museum and got one of those big checks and it was, you know, stand in front of a big check and that's it. No oversight, no review, no nothing. We're just kind of hoping you spend the money well, right? So really not a, you know, if you're interested in making sure your resources are spent well, not a very good way of doing it. The other problem with it is it seems to be, you know, sort of the carrot that a member of Congress has, right, in order to, you know, sort of maybe engage in behaviors that they shouldn't be. So we can talk about some of that now. So about 10 years after it starts, the K Street project starts to crash. So Tommy Lake gets indicted, and he got in trouble for basically illegally funneling campaign dollars to corporate contributions to various campaigns that you know, sort of were not legal. So he goes to jail, and he was sort of one of the big leaders of this. He was also on Dancing with the Stars after he got out of jail. That was weird. That you gotta look that one up, because that was really. So then Duke Cunningham, he goes to jail, and this is just straight classic bribery, right? This is just bribery. He just got out in 2013, but they found this little piece of paper on his boat, and it was actually like a bribe menu. So for $16 million in, you know, sort of some Pentagon appropriations bill, he gets a boat, BT, worth $140,000. So he actually wrote things down. Like, this is what you'll get. So really sort of a shocking, and the details in this article in particular is pretty good. Just, you know, sort of he was not in reality anymore. Sort of the idea that he could sort of ask for what he wanted and get what he wanted was pretty astounding. So he goes to jail. This is the longest sentence ever given to a member of Congress, right up until William Jefferson, which was not that long after. And important to note that this whole sort of the K Street project, that 95 sort of the next few years was very, very Republican, so the people going to jail were Republican. There was a lot of, sort of that side of the Congress really got nailed. This guy's a Democrat, but most of it was happening on the Republican side. So then he got nailed for essentially being a conduit for African nation bribery, something about corporations who wanted to do business in particular African countries, and he was sort of channeling bribes and accepting bribes. So he got, I think it was 13 years, and he just went in pretty recently.
There was also some stuff with like a nonprofit. So I was in
There's
New
all
Orleans when
kinds
this
of-
happened, and
Oh,
his
sorry.
entire family,
Yeah,
like, I think it's.
that's right. There
The
was-
entire family was indicted and
Yeah,
for corruption. Well, his sister was like on city council.
yes, there was all kinds of stuff. So it was a huge operation. So he went to jail. So in 1995, you have an updated Lobbying Disclosure Act. So this, remember, 95 is sort of the beginning of this. And then in 2006, you have Abramoff, and that really was, I mean, if you want to talk about sort of a tipping point, I think Abramoff was the tipping point. So does anybody know the Abramoff story? So basically, he got it. He did everything. I'm like everything you do wrong, he did wrong. But it was centered around these Indian tribes who were his clients, and he got nailed because he really took millions and millions from them and then used it for all these nefarious purposes. So there's a movie, and there's Moyers has a report. Capital Crimes has a documentary on that if you're interested. And then I'm gonna show a clip of him after he gets out of jail, so I'll spare you sort of any of my details. So then in 2007, basically they update LDA. They had the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act. And basically it says, all this stuff that's been going on, the trips to Scotland for the golfing, you can't do any of that. That's done. You can't sit down for dinner. If you can go to an event as long as you can't sit down. You can't go to an event where there's silverware. If it's toothpicks, that's okay. So they try to define, they try to define it enough so that you really wouldn't be able to do all the stuff that they were doing. But it ended up being this weird, sort of, okay, now you got old people who can't sit down, and, yeah.
I saw John McCain last summer in Pensacola, and I tried to get him a bottle of wine, he wouldn't accept it.
No. There was just a story about Brookings gave President Obama a coffee mug. And they spent like 6 months trying to figure out if he could accept it. On the subject of President Obama, so the timing was just right here, right, for him to really come out as very anti-lobbyist, and he did. And he said, there's no more revolving door, I'm not going to have any lobbyists in the White House. Literally no lobbyist could enter the White House. And so that actually did have an impact. And here's so I'm showing you the picture of this little office across the street from the White House because that's where they would go instead. Because they're not in the White House, right? So some people would find their way around, but I spoke to lobbyists at the time who said, you can no longer be on advisory boards, you can no longer participate in, anything that has anything to do with the White House, so you're shut out. Said a lot of your expertise, which is what you trade on, you can't use. So this was a pretty big deal. And then, so here's the lobbying disclosure. Limits on so members and how long they have to wait before they can actually lobby, stuff like that. There are a lot of ways around this though, and that's the real problem is you're going to find a way around it. On appropriations bills, this was